Hi, I'm Garth Glussman, Vice President of Basketball Operations from the NBA League office. And I want to outline the timeline of the pre-draft process for 2022, paying particular attention to the dates and events that are of importance to college players with remaining eligibility who may be thinking about turning professional or remaining in college for another year or longer. And now at the outset, I want to say that at the NBA League office, we view our work with the NCAA and the college basketball community throughout the pre-draft process as a service to the college basketball community, and in particular, the young men who are going through the process and making a pivotal decision about their future. Whether it's the Undergraduate Advisory Committee or outreach in general, we encourage players, coaches, and their family members to reach out to us at the NBA League office if we can be of any assistance at any point in time throughout this process. As this slide shows, the pre-draft process starts in April of each year, and it officially starts after a college player's season concludes. And the season includes any postseason games, whether that be in the NCAA tournament or the NIT. Once a player completes his college season, he is eligible to submit an application to the NBA Undergraduate Advisory Committee. And by submitting an application to the NBA Undergraduate Advisory Committee, the player ensures that he is able to receive written feedback from the NBA that will document how all 30 NBA teams feel about that player's prospects in the upcoming NBA draft. The player will receive that written feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee in advance of the NBA early entry deadline on April 24th. And we make a guarantee that for any player who submits his application to the Undergraduate Advisory Committee before the April 14th deadline, that they will receive their feedback reasonably in advance of the decision that they need to make on or before April 24th as to whether or not to enter the NBA draft. That is the primary purpose of the Undergraduate Advisory Committee, is to help players decide whether or not to enter the draft. Once the NBA early entry deadline has passed, the NBA League office will circulate a list of early entry players. And at that point, NBA teams will begin to contact early entry players for interviews and set up workouts and other opportunities for our teams to get to know players better so that they can make an informed decision in the upcoming draft. A significant component of the pre-draft process each year is the NBA Draft Combine, which takes place annually. And in this year, it will take place in Chicago, Illinois, from May 16th to the 22nd. On the front end of the NBA Draft Combine is a relatively new event, the NBA G League Elite Camp, which is held May 15th to the 17th in connection with the Combine at the same facility in Chicago. 40 players are invited to the G League Elite Camp, and 60 players are invited to the Combine. The Combine invitations are reserved to the top 60 or 65 players, and then the G League Elite Camp is reserved for the next 40 players or so. The G League Elite Camp takes place before the Combine because the highest performers at the G League Elite Camp earn the right to advance to the NBA Draft Combine. Following the NBA Draft Combine, the Undergraduate Advisory Committee will provide updated written feedback to any player whose name is still in the draft as an early entrant at that time. The NCAA early entry withdrawal deadline is on June 1st. And so the Undergraduate Advisory Committee makes a point of providing updated feedback in advance of the withdrawal deadline on June 1st. So again, players going through the process at that time have updated feedback before deciding whether or not they want to remain in the draft or pull their name out so that they can retain their college eligibility. That leads up to the NBA early entry withdrawal deadline on June 13th, which is not as applicable to college players and instead applies primarily to international players. But it still remains true under NBA rules that any player who withdraws his name from the draft prior to the NBA early entry withdrawal deadline is able to remove his name from consideration for the NBA draft. But if you miss the NCAA early entry withdrawal deadline, you could potentially harm your NCAA eligibility. So for college players with remaining eligibility who wish to return to college, it's truly that June 1st withdrawal deadline that governs. And we would ask players and coaches to be mindful of that June 1st deadline. That leads up to the draft on June 23rd, which this year will take place in Brooklyn, New York. That's always an exciting time for players and their families. And we look forward to seeing many of you there on June 23rd. This slide provides an overview of the NBA Undergraduate Advisory Committee. And the purpose of the Undergraduate Advisory Committee, or UAC for short, is to provide college underclassmen with an independent evaluation of their prospects in the upcoming NBA draft. At the NBA League office, we look at our work on the Undergraduate Advisory Committee as a service to the college basketball community, and in particular, the young men who are going through the pre-draft process or thinking about going through the pre-draft process and making a significant decision about whether to stay in school or begin their professional basketball career. The application window for the Undergraduate Advisory Committee begins as soon as a player's college season concludes. That includes any postseason tournament games, such as the NIT or the NCAA tournament. Once a player's season is over, the player can submit for feedback from the NBA Undergraduate Advisory Committee. The deadline for doing so is April 14th this year. And the reason that the deadline falls when it does is because we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to survey all NBA teams in time to provide the feedback to the players in advance of the NBA early entry deadline on April 24th. The feedback provided by the NBA Undergraduate Advisory Committee comes directly from NBA teams. All 30 teams have agreed to participate this year and to provide confidential feedback on each UAC applicant. The NBA League office then takes that confidential feedback on each player who applies for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee, aggregates that data, and then provides a written report to the player that summarizes where all 30 NBA teams believe the player is likely to be drafted, if the player is likely to be drafted at all. And so that first round of feedback, which comes in a written form, is delivered to the player typically in early April and no later than a few days before the early entry deadline on April 24th, 2022. Again, the whole purpose of the feedback is to help a player decide whether or not to enter the draft, which brings me to another significant point. And that is that applying for feedback from the Undergraduate Advisory Committee does not automatically enter a player in the draft. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because again, the whole purpose of the Undergraduate Advisory Committee is to inform a student athlete's decision as to whether or not he should enter the draft. It doesn't automatically enter a player in the draft. If a player intends to enter in the NBA draft as an early entrant, that process requires submitting separate paperwork to the NBA. So I want to make clear, requesting UAC feedback does not by itself enter a player in the draft. And in order to actually enter one's name in the draft, separate paperwork is required. After the NBA Draft Combine, we provide updated feedback to all college underclassmen who entered their names into the NBA draft and whose names remain in the NBA draft at that time. That feedback comes after the conclusion of the combine so that we can provide the players still in the pre-draft process with the most up-to-date feedback, because we find that teams' draft boards and a player's individual draft stock can change substantially based on how they perform or how other players perform at the G League Elite Camp and at the Combine. So it's important that our updated feedback takes those events into consideration before providing college players with feedback immediately prior to deciding whether or not they wish to remain in the draft or withdraw their name from the draft prior to the NCAA early entry deadline. So for players who go through the entire pre-draft process, they get 2 rounds of initial feedback. The first round comes again before the early entry deadline to guide whether or not the player wishes to enter the draft as an early entrant. And then that second round of updated feedback comes after the combine, shortly before a player must decide whether or not he wishes to remove his name from the draft in advance of the NCAA early entry withdrawal deadline, which this year falls on June 1st. This next slide provides a sample evaluation form that each undergraduate advisory committee applicant will receive after applying for feedback. As shown on this form, there are 2 key data points that each player will receive, both when they receive their initial feedback from the undergraduate advisory committee, and then if they remain in the draft, they will receive an updated form that looks like this as well, following the conclusion of the NBA draft combine and immediately before the NCAA early entry withdrawal deadline. And the 2 key data points provided on this form, first and foremost, are the player's most likely draft range. In this particular sample, the most likely draft range is the second round. It also provides on the bottom the actual vote breakdown that shows exactly how NBA teams voted on this particular player. And the intention behind these written forms is to provide complete transparency as much as the process allows. Obviously, the teams provide their feedback on a player on a confidential basis, so we can't provide the rating from a specific team. But as much as we possibly can, we want to be direct and transparent with players, coaches, and their family members so that there's no possibility of something being lost in translation. So by receiving this written feedback form, each player will know exactly how NBA teams voted on their prospects in the upcoming NBA draft. And our hope is that by providing this form of transparency in a direct fashion, that players, in consultation with their coaches, family members, and advisors, if appropriate, are able to make a decision that's right for them about whether to enter the 2022 NBA draft or remain in college for another season, or perhaps longer. This next slide provides an overview of the NBA Draft Combine, which is held annually, and this year will be held in Chicago from May 16th to the 22nd. Roughly 60 to 65 of the top draft eligible prospects in this year's NBA draft will be invited to participate in the combine in Chicago. Participants at the combine will be involved in medical evaluations, interviews with NBA teams, and in some cases, on-court competition that includes 5-on-5 games and other on-court drills. Participants also will go through a series of strength and agility tests and be available to the media. Players going through the pre-draft process often ask the NBA league office what, if any, signs they should look for to gauge their prospects in the upcoming NBA draft. Whether or not a player is invited to the combine is one of the best indicators based on our historical data as to whether or not a player will be drafted in the upcoming draft. Based on our historical data, if a player does not receive an invitation to the combine, he likely will not be drafted in the upcoming NBA draft. And when players go through the pre-draft process, combine applications typically go out beginning in early May. And so it can be a useful indicator for players around that time. Whether or not they receive an invitation to the combine is a useful indicator as to whether or not the player is likely to be drafted in the upcoming draft. This next slide provides an overview of the G League Elite Camp, which is held annually in connection with the combine in Chicago. The G League Elite Camp takes place at the same facility in Chicago and actually takes place on the front end of the combine. The top 40 draft eligible prospects who did not receive an invitation to the combine will be invited to participate in the G League Elite Camp. The most notable feature of the G League Elite Camp is that the best performers from the G League Elite Camp generally are invited to participate in the combine. So even if a player is not invited to the combine in the first instance, that player, if he's given the opportunity to participate in the G League Elite Camp, can actually earn his way into the combine. Even though the G League Elite Camp is still a relatively new event, the track record of the event shows that participants in the event have a strong likelihood of either being drafted, perhaps by earning their way into the combine and working their way up the draft board, but even more likely, they have a good chance of being on an NBA roster at some point during their rookie season, and an even greater number of G League Elite Camp participants have an opportunity to participate in NBA training camp and the G League during their rookie season as well. In some cases, players have been able to get invited to the G League Elite Camp and work their way up into a position where they can be drafted in the upcoming draft. So in total, when you take the 40 or so players who were invited to the G League Elite Camp, the 60 or so players who were invited to the combine, roughly 100 players will be invited to Chicago to participate in a combine-like setting in front of scouts from all 30 NBA teams. And those scouts will be given an opportunity to interact with the players, evaluate them in a variety of settings, including 5-on-5 competition, and ultimately make an informed decision in the upcoming draft.